You probably have heard advocates of physicalism, or materialism, present arguments the mind actually does reduce to the chemistry or processes of the brain. To be fair, physicalists do bring up some good arguments that they utilize to argue consciousness comes from the brain, so they need to be addressed and cannot be ignored. However, once we dive into their arguments and the evidence they use to back them up, you will see their arguments do not really amount to much, and at times, they ultimately reveal more evidence consciousness cannot be a product of the brain. One of the most utilized arguments is to use cases of brain damage. A large amount of neuroscientific research demonstrates things we attribute to the mind, like personality and moral judgments, can be systematically changed through brain damage or alterations. For example, there is evidence of frontotemporal disorder. Damage to this area of the brain can result in behavioral alterations, such as verbal disinhibitions, antisocial behavior, loss of concern for others, as well as changes in political ideology and patterns of dress. In 1999, Tony DiMaggio documented in Nature 2 cases of one male and one female who experienced brain damage to certain regions, and it resulted in disruptive and reckless behavior. So we cannot ignore that there is a wealth of evidence that brain damage can alter personality, memories, desires, ideologies, moral judgments, and more. If damaging the brain damages mental aspects of you, surely this would be evidence the mind is a creation of the brain. But this is assuming too much from mere correlations and attempting to derive causation. As we have said, on all views of the mind, we would expect the physical to affect our mental properties, just like we argued the mind can shape and modify brain chemistry. There is obviously an intricate relationship. It is a straw man or a misunderstanding by physicalists to assert substance dualists or idealists would not expect the mental and physical to be strongly connected and interdependent. Let's remember we have acknowledged part of our mental life is malleable, namely what we define as the soul. As we said, your soul evolves over time. It is your personality, your thoughts, dreams, emotions, memories, desires, etc. Your soul is the person you, a conscious mind, are becoming over time. It is contingent on the mind and is malleable. So the mind reads aspects of the soul, like a belief, in order to know how to act. But let's also remember where beliefs come from. They are not mystically inserted into the mind. They are developed through engaging and studying the physical world. Beliefs, like goals or memories, are built up over time by living and studying within a physical environment. So beliefs obviously have a physical aspect and are connected to your brain, which is what receives information from a physical environment for the mind. So this is how the mind is building a soul over time, by living a physical life. But if that is the case, it would be expected that aspects of the soul can be physically malleable or become damaged by physical interactions. Your soul is built from physical interactions, which the mind reads and stores, and the brain is the pathway for which the mind continues to interact in the physical world. If it is damaged, the mind cannot display the soul or fully read the damaged pathways to the information. Now, this is not to say your soul reduces to neurons, or that the brain creates the mental states, since there is no evidence mental states are emergent from or are identical to brain states. Rather, it is either that there are configurations in the brain the mind reads to gain access to the soul, or the brain is the extrinsic appearance of the mind and the soul operating within space-time. In other words, the brain is a physical representation of your mind with its soul. Substance dualist and philosopher J.P. Moreland explains this connection with an analogy of a CD. There is no music in the CD, there are only pits. CDs also do not create music. However, if the configurations on a CD are placed into the right retrieval system, music can be played. If the CD is damaged, the CD player can no longer properly read the configurations and play the music. Likewise, the mind can read pathways in the brain to access stored information of the soul. But if those pathways are changed or damaged, the underlying information the brain received and stored will no longer be available, or could be read in an altered way. The philosopher Keith Ward agrees. We can thus say that minds read or interpret the configurations of neurons, which store information that the brain has received from its environment. They may then influence this configuration by thoughts and further experience. The configuration is stored in the brain as a symphony is stored on a CD, and is ready to be read again, remembered, at a later time. This way of putting the matter requires that the brain functions properly. Configurations and interpretations can go wrong, and if the physical basis is blocked or damaged, they will go wrong. So it is not at all surprising that brain damage will cause predictable mental defects, or that particular mental processes are often found to be localized in specific areas of the brain. For idealists, the brain is a function of a conscious mind. It is the extrinsic appearance or avatar of what a conscious agent looks like in reality, by encapsulating consciousness into a spatial-temporal existence. As William James said, matter is not that which produces consciousness, but that which limits it. So the brain in a sense encapsulates consciousness and focuses it. If you affect the pathways in which consciousness is focusing, then of course you will affect how consciousness operates in reality. To elaborate more, the brain is not the complete agent, but a representation of what you and your soul appear as within a physical reality. Donald Hoffman has argued it is sort of like a user interface symbol of a conscious agent. Like how the icons on your computer screen are just symbols or representations of applications. What appears on your screen is just the extrinsic appearance of underlying code. But I won't drag the icon to the trash, as that can damage what I need to do on the computer. Likewise, if you change or damage the brain, which is the extrinsic appearance of consciousness in the soul within spacetime, of course you're going to affect how the agent operates in spacetime. So to argue from brain damage against the irreducibility of the mind is to misunderstand or not fully understand what substance dualists and idealists believe and argue for. Furthermore, certain instances of brain damage actually support the theory of irreducible consciousness over physicalist models, as brain damage or brain diseases can result in genius-level abilities. In certain instances of frontotemporal disorder, subjects have lost some normal abilities, but have somehow managed to unlock genius-level abilities. Another condition is called savant syndrome, and it also correlates with genius-level abilities, while one is typically deficient in other areas. The movie Rain Man was based on a 57-year-old patient with this condition who memorized over 6,000 books and has an encyclopedic knowledge of geography, music, literature, history, sports, and 9 other areas of expertise. He can name all the US area codes and major city zip codes. He has also memorized the maps in the front of a telephone book and can tell you precisely how to get from one US city to another, and then how to get around in that city, street by street. He also has calendar calculating abilities, and more recently, rather advanced musical talent has surfaced. Of unique interest is his ability to read extremely rapidly, simultaneously scanning one page with the left eye and the other page with the right eye. Magnetic resonance imaging shows the absence of the corpus callosum, along with other substantial central nervous system damage. Other research has reported these abilities correlate with brain damage, and that no physicalist model of the brain can currently account for this data. However, this data would be expected if the brain is not what creates consciousness, but that which limits consciousness. Brain damage can hinder the mind's functional abilities to operate within spacetime. But if the brain is limiting consciousness, brain damage would be expected in some circumstances to unlock access to more abilities that are hindered by standard brain functioning. Thus, cases of brain damage that unlock genius-level abilities seem inconsistent with physicalism, but are expected on irreducible models of consciousness. The next objection is to argue that consciousness can be turned off and on again by affecting the brain through something like general anesthesia or just basic sleep. Researchers have also recently found a place in the brain that seems to turn on and off consciousness. So the argument is that we can become unconscious, but we as a body still exist. So then it follows that consciousness is not fundamental, but likely a dependent feature of the brain. The philosopher of mind Bernardo Kastrup responds to this with a hypothetical scenario. Imagine that you wake up in the morning after hours of deep sleep. You may remember nothing of what happened during those preceding hours, concluding that you were unconscious all night. Then later in the day, you suddenly remember that you actually had a very intense dream. So you were not unconscious all night, you simply could not remember your experiences. In reality, the body being physically unconscious doesn't mean the agent is unconscious. It probably is just the case that we do not remember everything that happens when we're asleep or under anesthesia. Lack of memory doesn't mean we're unconscious. In fact, research has come out that has argued states we presume mean unconsciousness actually come with intense experiences. In one study, 60% of subjects remembered dreamlike experiences in anesthetic-induced states. G-force-induced loss of consciousness has also been seen to correlate with memorable dreams. Another study has pointed out there is good evidence consciousness doesn't disappear during dreamless sleep. From the outset, there is good empirical and theoretical reasons for saying that a range of different types of sleep experience, some of which are distinct from dreaming, can occur in all stages of sleep. So just because you don't remember everything while you are physically unconscious, that doesn't mean you are entirely unconscious. There is no reason to conclude consciousness can be turned off and on. Only that an agent's brain needs rest or is disconnected due to specific types of drugs, and is temporarily disconnected from normal experience of physical reality. The next argument is from artificial intelligence. Every day, computers are becoming more intelligent, so physicalists argue it is likely they will one day become self-aware and therefore conscious. So they argue we're currently observing consciousness and a sense of the self arising from physical matter within computers. Well, this is speculative and assuming more than some realize. John Sear's Chinese room argument demonstrates this. In his own words, imagine that you're locked in a room, and that in this room are several baskets full of Chinese symbols. Imagine that you, like me, do not understand a word of Chinese, but that you're given a rule book in English for manipulating these Chinese symbols. The rules specify the manipulations of the symbols purely formally in terms of their syntax, not their semantics. So the rule might say, take a squiggle squiggle sign out of basket number 1 and put it next to a squoggle squoggle sign from basket number 2. Now suppose that some other Chinese symbols are passed into the room and that you are given further rules for passing back Chinese symbols out of the room. Suppose that unknown to you, the symbols passed into the room are called questions by the people outside of the room, and that the symbols you pass back out of the room are called answers to the questions. Suppose furthermore that the programmers are so good at designing the programs and that you are so good at manipulating the symbols that very soon your answers are indistinguishable from those of a native Chinese speaker. There you are locked in your room, shuffling your Chinese symbols and passing out Chinese symbols in response to incoming Chinese symbols. On the basis of the situation, as I have described it, there is no way you could learn Chinese simply by manipulating these formal symbols. Now the point of the story is simply this. By virtue of implementing a formal computer program, from the point of view of an outside observer, you behave exactly as if you understand Chinese. But all the same, you don't understand a word of Chinese. But if going through the appropriate computer program for understanding Chinese is not enough to give you an understanding of Chinese, then it is not enough to give any digital computer an understanding of Chinese. The point being, the person inside the room would simulate perfectly someone who understands Chinese. The people outside would be fooled into believing there was a fluent speaker inside. But the Chinese room would only imitate the mental understanding of Chinese, not actually possess it. Computers are really just like Chinese rooms. They can only imitate mental understanding through syntax, but they cannot understand the meaning of things, like you cannot understand the meaning of each symbol in the Chinese room. Edward Kelly reminds us, human cognitive performance is characteristically guided by insight and overall grasp of the problem situation, with essential aspects at the foreground of attention set against an organizing but largely implicit background. Specific facts or features of the situation may only become evident through a deliberate attentive effort. For the computer, all facts must be specified in advance as explicit bits of atomic data. Whatever crude representation of the situation the computer can achieve is necessarily constructed by explicit calculation upon these situation-independent facts. Central human mental skills are in principle not reproducible on digital computers. Other researchers have pointed out the same thing. Computer learning is nothing like how a conscious agent learns. Computers cannot do anything or go beyond symbol manipulation. So no matter how good they get at this, they will never amount to consciousness, because manipulating syntax is not what consciousness or being self-aware is about. As we noted in the previous video, a mere pattern of syntax within the brain or a computer cannot be about something, like a belief is about something. If a belief is only stored as a pattern, it only becomes a belief in a mind. A neural pattern or line of computer code cannot be a belief, just like bumps on a CD are not music, or like how ink and paper are not the same as the message. They merely transfer meaning that only makes sense when read by a mind. Without a mind, there is no meaning on the page. So beliefs themselves are not logically identical to patterns within the brain or lines of code in a computer. They are merely correlated, like ink in a message. We as minds must be conscious of beliefs. Information itself does not produce consciousness or aboutness. Another argument from Physicalists is to argue recent research has demonstrated that through technology, we can remap to a degree the visuals people see just from looking at blood flow. So some physicalists argue this means we can recall mental images from brain scans, and that the brain creates the mind in the same way. Well, the biggest problem with this is those making this argument have overblown the research. The studies are looking at the primary visual cortex as patients view clips, then recreating them from the blood flow in this section of the brain. This is not viewing an image created by the mind from pure imagination or viewing images from the brain at large, let alone viewing consciousness. It is simply looking at the blood flow in one region of the brain. Basically, a strong magnetic wave is sent which interacts with the water and blood. The water and blood begins to vibrate and emits a magnetic signal back to the fMRI machine. This is not the same as observing private mental experiences, or experiences generated by neurons. It is actually only sensing changes in blood flow in the visual cortex of a patient. We are only looking at incoming information from the eyes, which we would expect to visually look like what the eye is viewing externally. As we explained earlier, no one rejects these forms of upward causation, whereby a mind utilizes the brain to receive incoming information, like we explained earlier with the analogy Keith Ward and J.P. Moreland used. The mind can read pathways in the brain and view incoming images. Another study found images produced by imagination preserves the geometric profile of letter shapes from images produced visually. Basically, subjects were shown one of 4 letters and then asked to imagine the letter they just saw. fMRI scans were simultaneously performed on the visual cortex. In some cases, correlating brain activity appeared between the visual images and the imagined images. However, we have to be careful not to overestimate the implications of this study. Like before, this is not viewing images from pure imagination. Subjects visually viewed something and then were asked to think about what they just visually saw. Thinking about a memory of a visual image you just experienced would be expected to match the brain activity of the image. This would be expected on the theory of mind that we have been explaining throughout this series. This would only explain aspects of the soul as patterns in the brain, which we have argued are built from the bottom up. I fail to see how this would show the mind is reducible to the brain. Furthermore, subjects only looked at one of 4 letters, and the R value at its best was only around 0.5, which basically means the predictive model explains only 25% of the variance in the data. This is not better than mere guesswork. If you thought of one of 4 letters just from guessing, I would have a 25% chance of getting it right. In many cases, the brain activity didn't line up, let alone resemble the letter they were thinking of. At best, the research shows the brain activity of what you visually see correlates to the brain activity of remembering that visual image. Finally, the sample size was only 6 subjects. This is an extremely low sample size. It should be paired with this meta-analysis from 2020, which looked at over 90 different experiments and found converging evidence demonstrating a poor reliability of task fMRI measures for use in predicting mental properties. They also found brain activity observed in subjects performing a task appeared to be different if measured more than once, and therefore the neural correlates of mental activity seem to change and are not as strong as previously thought. Thus, they conclude, our meta-analysis of task fMRI reliability revealed an average test-retest reliability coefficient of 0.397, which is below the minimum required for good reliability and far below the recommended cutoffs for clinical application or individual level interpretation. They also note, adequately powered studies require a total sample of more than 2,000, but studies with high sample sizes are severely lacking in neuroscientific studies. So this one individual study has an extremely low sample size and low evidence of neural correlates, meaning its results are practically meaningless. Also, even if the conclusions are successful in showing that we can display imagined images within brain activity, this would only show how aspects of the soul are stored as neural patterns within brain activity, not how mind or consciousness would emerge from the brain. The next objection is to argue from the famous Libet experiments. In the early 1980s, researcher Benjamin Libet had subjects hooked up to a machine to measure brain activity while they were asked to randomly decide to press a button. The subjects were asked to note when they consciously decided to press the button. He then found that prior to them becoming consciously aware, there was a buildup of brain activity, later titled the readiness potential. Later studies saw this buildup 10 seconds prior to a conscious decision. Others deduced from this research, this means the brain is the cause of conscious activity, because the buildup of the readiness potential was occurring prior to our conscious decisions. While there were several problems with this data, later research has demonstrated the readiness potential was present even when subjects did not make any conscious decisions. If this supposed readiness potential is present even when decisions are not being made, then it doesn't follow it is causing conscious decisions. This was confirmed in several repeated studies, thereby debunking the idea the readiness potential was causing conscious brain activity. In one 2008 study, subjects were told they had to press a button when they saw a cube, among many other distractors such as a circle, triangle, hexagon, etc. Simultaneously, their brain activity was measured. It was found that the readiness potential was present even before the stimuli appeared on the screen. Our results show that the neural activity, which is present prior to motor responses, emerges well before the presentation of a stimulus. At that time, the participants were not capable of knowing whether to press the left hand or the right hand button before a stimulus appeared. In addition, the activation preceding the stimulation did not differ significantly between the two response alternatives. Thus, the observed activity cannot be regarded as a specific preparation to press one of the buttons rather than the other one. Thus, the readiness potential could not be the cause of a conscious decision, unless the subjects were psychic and knew what would appear on the screen. Another problem is that none of these experiments deal with serious decisions like moral decisions or life choices. Rather, they are focused on studying arbitrary decisions that require no deep intellectual thinking. And the fact that the readiness potential is present sometimes when there are no conscious decisions should give us reason to doubt this is a correlate of the brain building up to a conscious decision. Other studies have directly looked at if the readiness potential correlates with deliberate decision making instead of making arbitrary decisions, and the results have found no correlation. We directly compared the neural correlates of deliberate and arbitrary decision making during a $1,000 donation task to nonprofit organizations. While we found the expected readiness potentials for arbitrary decisions, they were strikingly absent for deliberate ones. Our results are congruent with the readiness potential representing the accumulation of noisy, random fluctuations, which drive arbitrary but not deliberate decisions. The absence of readiness potentials in deliberate decisions further points to the different neural mechanisms underlying deliberate and arbitrary decisions, and thus challenges the generalizability of studies that argue for no causal rule for consciousness in decision-making from arbitrary to deliberate real-life decisions. So the readiness potential doesn't even correlate with conscious deliberate decisions that we normally make in life, and more likely correlates with noisy, random fluctuations. However, even if the readiness potential could cause decisions, Libet responded to his own work, as he still held to a belief in free will. He suggested from later research the brain activity, or what we might call aspects of the soul, would act on their own, but the mind had the ability to interfere and veto the buildup or readiness potential from carrying out a decision. In other words, the soul, through the brain, can run on autopilot and carry out decisions, but the mind or the self has the ability to interfere by preventing the activity from being carried out. Think of Ward's earlier analogy of comparing the brain to a CD. The brain would continue to play on its own until the mind stops it. This could be compared to how we tend to do things without thinking, like daydreaming or fidgeting, unless you as a conscious mind interfere with the autopilot features of the soul. This has been called the mind's ability to free won't and take control of the brain activity by preventing it from going forward. This is cited by neuroscientist Jeffrey Schwartz in his book The Mind and the Brain as further evidence of his own research that the mind is capable of modifying and changing the chemistry of the brain, which we covered extensively in the first video of this series. If the brain actually was causing decisions to be made through the readiness potential, and the supposed evidence for it doesn't even hold up, one could still argue from the work of researchers like Libet and Schwartz to demonstrate the mind has the ability to interfere to produce real changes in the brain as the final gatekeeper to if a decision is to be carried out or stopped. Physicalists will also sometimes use the results of this study to argue the brain creates conscious intentions. Researchers stimulated right inferior parietal regions, which triggered a strong intention and desire to move. Thus, it has been argued we can show how the will arises from the brain by creating intentions through stimulation. However, this seems to be overstating what the research shows. When these regions were stimulated, subjects reported the desire to move. You can have desires or a feeling you ought to do something that in reality only influences you, but does not actually cause your decision. Charismatic leaders can create strong desires in people that only influence the conscious decisions of their followers, but they do not literally control the will. You can give a subject a drug, which can temporarily change or influence their desires, and thus affect how the mind operates in reality. But you don't actually control the will. And as we just went over, the brain can run on autopilot, and the mind can act as a final gatekeeper and cancel desires from being carried out. So even though through electrical stimulation, you can create intentions and desires in a subject, that doesn't mean you are making or controlling the will. Only aspects of the soul the mind can utilize if a mind decides so. Furthermore, within the study, when stimulation intensity was increased, the feeling of desires or intentions were replaced by an illusion they did actually move, but without it actually being carried out in reality. What did not happen is a subject feeling like they acted upon a desire and carried it out. So stimulating this region only seems to be associated with intentions and feeling them, not controlling the will. Therefore, it appears stimulation only created desires and illusions of movements. It did not actually demonstrate the brain creates the will of an individual. As Wilder Penfield said, there is no place in the cerebral cortex where electrical stimulation will cause a patient to believe or to decide. I am forced to conclude that there is no valid evidence that either epileptic discharge or electrical stimulation can activate the mind. So with that being said, this brings us to the final objection of split brain patients. In some subjects, the connections between the right hemisphere and the left hemisphere have been severed, and some researchers have argued two distinct minds emerge. This objection is often used to show that if the brain can be divided, then consciousness can be divided. So consciousness must be dependent on the brain, and we can demonstrate consciousness is not irreducible. However, this is a gross oversimplification of the research. The first thing to note is that split brain patients appear completely normal under ordinary circumstances. They can drive, hold jobs, appear to have one personality, etc. The disunity in their behavior only appears under very specialized testing conditions. A typical experimental testing condition which shows this disunity is where two stimuli are presented to a split brain patient simultaneously. Language is dominant in the left hemisphere. Therefore, when the subject says what they saw, they will say it was a dog. But when they point with their left hand to what they saw, since the left hand is controlled by the right hemisphere, they will point to a cat. So this is what is used to assert a split brain patient has two streams of consciousness, one in the left hemisphere and one in the right hemisphere. And they use this to argue for a physical basis of consciousness. This is called the two-stream model. However, there's a lot of research which challenges this model. First, research from Hal Pashler suggests a sense of unification is still present in split brain patients. When normal subjects are presented with two stimuli, one after the other, the second stimulus is processed in the brain after a short period of time and not immediately, like the first. This period of time is called the psychological refractory period. It occurs because the subject is processing the first stimulus, and when the second stimulus arrives, it has to wait until the first stimulus is processed. So this should not occur in split brain patients under the two-stream model, which says there is a split in consciousness and stimuli can be processed separately. But Pashler found that this psychological refractory period also occurs in split brain patients. In other words, he presented a stimulus to the left eye, which projects to the right visual cortex, and a second stimulus to the right eye. These visual cortices are disconnected from each other in split brain patients, and thus are not communicating. But Pashler found that the presentation of the first stimulus caused a delay in the processing of the second stimulus, which shouldn't occur in split brain patients, because the areas where the stimuli are processed are disconnected and cannot exchange information. So this implies, according to this data, that split brain patients have a unified attention and that the first and second stimuli are processed normally instead of at the same time. Second, two studies have found that motion and the size of visual objects are shared between two disconnected hemispheres. Third, Dr. Michael Gazinga has found that attention is largely integrated in split brain patients. He writes, "The data indicate that even though both simple and complex perceptual information associated with the cognitive activities of each disconnected half-brain show virtually no interactions, the attentional system remains largely integrated in the split brain patient. Taken together, studies to date support the view that the attentional system is an independently functioning and integrated entity, following brain bisection, that participates in both perceptual and cognitive activities of each hemisphere." Fourth, and most importantly, the most convincing evidence comes from observing the everyday behavior of these patients. They seem completely normal to other people, hold jobs, mostly do not experience changes in personality, humor, etc. More importantly, they seem to have no problems in engaging in tasks which require bimanual coordination. Think of riding a bicycle or driving a car. Pushing down on one pedal on one side must be accompanied by a simultaneous relaxation of the leg on the other side, while also maintaining balance and steering. The act of steering itself must also be coordinated between the two hands, as one hand needs to push while the other hand needs to relax its grip on the handlebar. The problem for the two-stream model is that the two halves of the body are controlled by different hemispheres. How is it that a split-brain patient can ride a bicycle, walk, or drive a car, or even play the piano, after the cerebral hemispheres are disconnected? D.W. Zadel writes, "Each patient behaves as one with a single personality and unified consciousness. Thus we must look at what is amiss in order to distinguish between the apparent and the real." Now, this is not to say there are no real differences in split-brain patients. There are obvious issues where a split-brain patient can disagree with himself and seem to have different emotions or views at the same time. So it does appear from the research there is a unity of consciousness, but a disconnect of information processing within the brain. All this data together would be very hard to explain under the two-stream model, which holds that both sides are conscious at once. But all this data fits with Tim Bain's switch model. He says the switch model holds that consciousness in the split brain switches between the patient's two hemispheres. The hemispheres contribute in succession to the contents of the patient's consciousness. But for the most part at least, consciousness does not occur in both hemispheres simultaneously. This seems to be the most consistent with the data, as the model understands there is a split in the brain, but there is still a unified consciousness who simply has trouble unifying all aspects of the soul. As various studies indicate, there is a united consciousness that is largely integrated as a whole. So the mind cannot access the complete information of the soul due to the brain hemispheres being disconnected. On top of that, based on what Libet and Schwartz talk about in their research, one could argue that split-brain patients suffer from a hemisphere working on its own due to the disconnect in the brain. The mind is unable to take full control of the brain due to the disconnect and veto actions from being carried out. In other words, the autopilot features of the soul are running on their own, and the mind cannot fully veto certain actions. So physicalist objections from science against the existence and fundamental nature of the mind can be addressed easily, and sometimes by just explaining what dualists and idealists are actually advocating for. The arguments offered by physicalists still lack explanatory scope and power of how the brain could potentially create a conscious agent. It cannot show the mind is reducible to something physical. As E.J. Lowe says, reductive physicalism, far from being equipped to solve the so-called easy problems of consciousness, has in fact nothing very useful to say about any aspect of consciousness.